They said London would fall in 3 weeks. The Nazi high command had calculated it with cold precision. Reduce the city to rubble, break the British spirit, and watch an empire crumble. But they hadn't counted on one thing: the men and women who had run toward the flames while everyone else ran away. This is the story of the Auxiliary Fire Service, the forgotten soldiers of the Blitz, who fought a different kind of war with nothing but water, courage, and an unbreakable will to survive. If you're ready to discover one of World War II's most incredible untold stories, make sure you're subscribed, because what you're about to hear will change everything you thought you knew about the Blitz. September 7th, 1940, 4:43 p.m. The air raid sirens began their haunting wail across London for what would become the first night of 57 consecutive nights of bombing. But this wasn't just another raid. This was the beginning of hell on earth. 348 German bombers, escorted by 617 fighters, darkened the skies over London. It was the largest aerial assault the world had ever seen. Their target? Everything. The docks, the warehouses, the homes, the hospitals, the schools. Nothing was sacred. By the time the last bomber turned back toward France at 4:30 the following morning, over 1,000 tons of high-explosive bombs and countless incendiary devices had transformed London into an inferno that could be seen from over 100 miles away. The Thames itself seemed to burn. The river reflected flames so intense that German pilots the following night wouldn't even need their navigational equipment. They simply followed the glow of a dying city. But here's what the history books often miss, what the newsreels didn't always show. While the Royal Air Force fought in the skies above, another battle raged in the streets below. A battle fought not with bullets and bombs, but with water hoses and bare hands. A battle where the enemy was fire itself, and the soldiers were often teenagers, pensioners, and volunteers who had never fought a blaze in their lives. Let me take you back to that first night. Imagine you're a 19-year-old auxiliary fireman. They called you AFS for Auxiliary Fire Service. You joined up 6 months ago thinking you'd help put out the occasional house fire, maybe rescue a cat from a tree. You've been through basic training, sure, but nothing could prepare you for this. The call comes in at 5:15 p.m. All stations respond. Multiple fires reported across East London. You climb aboard the fire engine with your crew. Most of them are men who were too old for the military or had been rejected for medical reasons. Your driver is a 52-year-old greengrocer named Albert. The man operating the pump is a bank clerk who still wears his tie under his fire tunic. You're terrified, but you dare not show it. As your engine races through the streets, you see it. The eastern horizon is glowing orange, then red, then a terrifying yellow-white. It's as if the sun is rising in the wrong direction. The heat hits you first, even from a mile away, a blast of superheated air that makes you gasp. Then comes the noise, the crackle of burning timber, the explosion of gas mains, the crash of collapsing buildings, and underneath it all, a roar like some ancient dragon awakening. You arrive at West Ham to find a scene from Dante's Inferno. The massive warehouses along the Thames are burning, warehouses filled with rubber, paint, rum, sugar, and timber. The paint warehouse explodes in a fountain of burning liquid that rains down across 3 city blocks. The rum warehouse creates rivers of flaming alcohol that flow through the streets, setting fire to everything they touch. The rubber produces thick, black smoke so toxic that men collapse just from breathing it. "Get that line forward," your officer screams, but you can barely hear him over the chaos. You grab the hose. It's heavy, much heavier than in training, and you advance toward a burning building. The heat is unbearable. You're 50 feet away and you can feel your eyebrows singeing. Your uniform is steaming. The rubber of your boots is starting to melt. Then you hear it. A sound that will haunt you for the rest of your life. A woman, screaming from a third-floor window. She's trapped, silhouetted against the flames behind her. You look around desperately for the rescue team, but they're overwhelmed. There are 100 buildings burning, 1,000 people trapped. This is where ordinary men became legends. Stay with me, because what happens next will take your breath away. Your officer, that 52-year-old greengrocer named Albert, doesn't hesitate. He drops his hose and runs toward the building. The entrance is an inferno, impossible to enter. But there's a drain pipe. Weakened by heat, probably ready to collapse at any moment. Albert starts climbing. He's overweight, not athletic, certainly not trained for this, but he climbs. The crowd that's gathered goes silent. Even the other firefighters stop what they're doing to watch. Albert reaches the second floor, then the third. The woman is hysterical, barely able to move. He talks to her, calm and steady, like he's explaining the price of carrots in his shop. He gets around to his back, and he starts climbing down. Halfway down, the drain pipe gives way. For a moment that lasts forever, they're falling. But Albert twists his body, taking the impact. They hit a pile of debris. Painful, certainly, but they're alive. The woman has a broken arm. Albert has cracked ribs and burns on his hands. He refuses to go to the hospital. He says there's others what need it more, and he goes back to his pump.
That was just one rescue, on one street, in one neighborhood, during one night of bombing. Multiply that by 57 nights. Multiply it by thousands of firefighters. Begin to understand the scale of heroism we're talking about. But here's what makes this story even more remarkable. Most of these firefighters weren't professional firefighters at all. Before the war, London had only about 2,000 professional firemen. When the government realized that war was coming, they created the Auxiliary Fire Service, a volunteer force of ordinary citizens who would be trained to fight fires during air raids. By September 1940, the AFS had recruited over 23,000 men and women in London alone. Men who were too old for military service, women who wanted to serve their country, conscientious objectors who refused to kill but were willing to die saving others. Boys as young as 16 who lied about their age. Grandfathers in their 60s who knew they had one more fight left in them. They came from every walk of life. There were writers and artists, teachers and taxi drivers, shopkeepers and solicitors. There was a member of parliament who served as an ordinary fireman. There were professional athletes and musicians. There was even a famous jazz drummer named Ray Ellington, who would become a hero of the Blitz before going on to post-war fame. The professional firefighters, the London Fire Brigade regulars, initially looked down on these volunteers. Weekend warriors, they called them. They'll run at the first sign of real danger. The AFS men and women heard the whispers, felt the contempt. They knew they had something to prove. That first night of the Blitz, they proved it. And they kept proving it, night after night, for 8 months straight. Let me tell you about the equipment they had to work with. Actually, let me tell you about the equipment they didn't have. Many of the fire engines were converted taxis and delivery trucks. The hoses were a mixture of different sizes that often didn't connect properly. The breathing apparatus was primitive, leather helmets and wet cloths over the face. Some fire stations didn't even have proper boots for all their crews. Water pressure was a constant nightmare. The Germans deliberately targeted water mains, knowing that without water, the fires would spread unchecked. Firefighters would connect their hoses to hydrants only to find a trickle or nothing at all. They improvised, pumping water from the Thames, from canals, from swimming pools, even from burst water mains in the streets. And then there were the bombs themselves. The Germans didn't just drop high explosives, they dropped delayed action bombs designed to explode hours or even days after landing. A firefighter could be battling a blaze when suddenly the ground beneath him would erupt. Entire crews were lost this way, with no warning, no chance to run. There were also the incendiary bombs, small magnesium devices that burned at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Celsius. One bomber could carry hundreds of them. They would rain down like deadly hail, each one capable of starting a fire that could consume an entire building. The only way to stop them was to catch them before they burned through the roof, which meant firefighters scrambling across burning rooftops in the middle of an air raid, kicking these hot white devices off buildings with their boots. Imagine that for a moment. You're on a rooftop, flames shooting up around you, German bombers overhead still dropping their loads, and you're literally kicking incendiary bombs off the edge of the building with your foot. One misstep and you fall through the burning roof to your death. One direct hit from a bomb and you're vaporized. But you keep going because if you don't, the whole block will burn and the families sheltering in the basements below will die. This is the kind of courage we're talking about. Raw, unfiltered heroism that most people today can't even imagine. And we're just getting started. December 29th, 1940, the night that would become known as the Second Great Fire of London, a deliberate echo of the catastrophic fire of 1666 that had destroyed medieval London. The Germans had chosen their timing carefully. It was a Sunday night, most businesses were closed and empty, and it was low tide on the Thames, meaning less water available for firefighting. At 6 p.m., the sirens wailed again. By 6:15 p.m., over 100,000 incendiary bombs had fallen on the City of London, the historic square mile of financial district. The old buildings, many dating back centuries, burned like kindling. The fire crews responded immediately, but they faced an impossible situation. Many of the buildings were locked and empty. To get inside to fight the fires, they had to break down doors and windows, wasting precious time. The incendiaries had already taken hold, spreading from building to building faster than the crews could contain them. St. Paul's Cathedral, the crown jewel of London's skyline, the symbol of British resilience, was directly in the path of the firestorm that night. 28 incendiary bombs hit the cathedral that night. If St. Paul's fell, the psychological blow to British morale might be catastrophic. Churchill himself had given the order, St. Paul's must be saved at all costs. The cathedral had its own fire watch, volunteers who lived in the building during the Blitz watching for incendiaries. When the bombs hit, these men and women sprang into action. They raced across the roof and through the internal spaces, finding and extinguishing incendiaries before they could take hold. One bomb penetrated the dome itself and lodged in the lead of the inner shell. If it had burned through, the entire dome would have been lost.
But here's the incredible part. While a handful of fire watchers were inside the cathedral, over 300 firefighters formed a protective ring around the building. They fought fires in the surrounding buildings, preventing the flames from spreading to St. Paul's. They worked through the night, through continuing bombing raids, through collapsing buildings and exploding gas mains. When dawn broke on December 30th, and Londoners emerged from their shelters to see what remained of their city, they saw something that brought tears to their eyes. St. Paul's Cathedral, still standing, its dome rising defiantly above a sea of smoke and ruins. The photograph of the cathedral wreathed in smoke became one of the most iconic images of the war. But here's what that photograph doesn't show: the bodies of the firefighters who died making sure that image was possible. That night alone, 16 firefighters were killed in the City of London. Dozens more were seriously injured. They had saved St. Paul's, but the price was paid in blood. Throughout the Blitz, the casualty rate among firefighters was staggering. By the time the sustained bombing ended in May 1941, nearly 1,000 firefighters had been killed and over 7,000 seriously injured. These weren't soldiers trained for combat, remember? They were volunteers, civilians, ordinary people who had simply refused to let their city burn. And here's something that might surprise you. Over 80 women served in the auxiliary fire service during the Blitz. They weren't allowed to fight fires directly, the regulations forbade it, but they served as dispatch operators, drivers, and in support roles. Many of them ignored those regulations when the situation was desperate, grabbing hoses and fighting alongside the men. One woman, a dispatch operator named Gillian Tanner, stayed at her post for 48 hours straight during a particularly heavy raid, coordinating fire crews across North London despite the building being hit twice by bombs. She was awarded the George Medal for her courage. When someone asked her why she didn't evacuate when the building was hit, she simply said, "The boys needed to know where to go. Someone had to tell them." That phrase, "someone had to tell them," captures something essential about the spirit of the Blitz. Someone had to fight the fires. Someone had to rescue the trapped. Someone had to stand between chaos and civilization. These firefighters decided that someone would be them.
If this story is resonating with you, do me a favor, hit that like button. It helps others discover these forgotten heroes. As the weeks turned into months, these volunteer firefighters became true professionals. They developed techniques and tactics that would revolutionize firefighting worldwide. They learned to read fires, to predict how they would spread, to identify which buildings could be saved and which had to be abandoned. They learned to work together with a precision that would have impressed any military unit. They also developed a dark sense of humor that helped them cope with the horrors they witnessed. They gave nicknames to different types of bombs. They sang songs while fighting fires. They made bets on which buildings would collapse first. It wasn't disrespect, it was survival. You either laughed or you went mad. But beneath the humor, there was trauma. These men and women saw things that would haunt them forever. They pulled children's bodies from burning buildings. They watched colleagues die in front of them. They worked until they collapsed from exhaustion, then got up and worked some more. Many of them developed what we would now recognize as PTSD, though in 1940 they just called it being shapen, and you were expected to get on with it. One firefighter, a man named Thomas Williams, who kept a diary throughout the Blitz, wrote this entry after a particularly bad night. "Today we lost Jenkins. Good man. Roof came down on him while he was inside a shop trying to save the owner's stock. Stupid way to die, really. Saving things instead of lives. But that was Jenkins. Always thought about others first. Tonight we drink to Jenkins. Tomorrow we go back to work. Because if we stop, if we give up, then Jenkins died for nothing. And I'll be damned if I let that happen." That diary entry captures the spirit perfectly. They kept going not because they were fearless, they were terrified, but because stopping wasn't an option. They kept going for their fallen comrades, they kept going for their city, they kept going because someone had to. As we approach the end of this first part of our story, I want you to understand something crucial. The firefighters of the Blitz didn't stop any bombs from falling. They didn't shoot down any German planes. They didn't win any traditional military victories. But they won something far more important. They won the battle for London's soul. Every fire they extinguished was a small victory against tyranny. Every life they saved was a rejection of Nazi ideology. Every night they showed up for duty was a statement that Britain would not break, would not bend, would not surrender. The Germans thought they could bomb Britain into submission. They thought that if they made life unbearable enough, the British people would demand peace at any price. They hadn't counted on the firefighters, on the ordinary men and women who would sacrifice everything to save their neighbors, their city, their way of life. In Part 2, we're going to dive deeper into the specific battles these heroes fought. We're going to meet individuals whose courage defies belief. We're going to witness the night that almost broke London and discover how the firefighters saved it. You won't want to miss this. This is the story of the night London burned, but it's also the story of the nights London refused to fall. It's the story of heroes who wore helmets instead of capes, who wielded water hoses instead of weapons, and who proved that sometimes the greatest courage is found not in fighting, but in saving. Stay tuned for Part 2, where the real battle begins.
The second week of October, 1940, the Blitz has become routine, if hell itself can ever be called routine. Tonight, we focus on the stories that history almost forgot. The individual acts of heroism that happened so frequently, they became almost mundane to those who lived through them. Almost. Before we dive in, if you haven't watched Part 1, go back and watch it now. This story builds on itself, and you need to understand where we started to appreciate where we're going. Let me introduce you to Station Officer Frank Hurd of the Auxiliary Fire Service, Lambeth Division. Frank was 43 years old, a plumber by trade, with 3 children and a wife named Margaret. He had joined the AFS in 1939, thinking he'd be helping with minor emergencies. By October 1940, Frank Hurd had become one of the most decorated firefighters in London, though he'd never tell you that himself. On the night of October 15th, Frank's crew received a call that would test everything they'd learned. A direct hit on a tenement building in Kennington had caused the entire structure to collapse, but witnesses reported hearing children crying from beneath the rubble. The building was still burning. Gas mains were ruptured, feeding the flames. And worst of all, the structure was unstable. It could collapse further at any moment, crushing anyone underneath. The rescue teams arrived first, but they took one look at the situation and called for firefighters. The fire had to be suppressed before any rescue attempt could begin, but getting close enough to fight the fire meant crawling into a death trap of unstable rubble and live flames. Frank didn't hesitate. He grabbed a hose line and advanced into the wreckage, crawling on his belly through gaps barely wide enough for his body. Behind him, two of his crew followed with additional equipment. Above them, massive concrete slabs hung at impossible angles, held up by nothing but debris and luck. They could hear the children now. 2 voices, maybe 3, coming from somewhere deep in the wreckage. Frank called out to them, keeping his voice calm and steady. "We're coming for you, loves. Just keep talking so we know where you are." The children were terrified, screaming for their mother. Frank later said that sound would stay with him forever. Pure terror in children's voices. For 3 hours, Frank and his crew worked in those ruins. They fought fires in pockets of debris. They shored up collapsing sections with timbers. They dug with their hands when their tools couldn't fit. All the while, German bombers continued overhead, and the structure groaned and shifted around them. At 2:30 a.m., they broke through to a small void space. There, huddled together, were 3 children, ages 4, 6, and 8. Their mother had shielded them with her body when the building collapsed. She was dead, but her sacrifice had saved them. Frank and his men passed the children back through the tunnel they'd created, one by one, into the arms of waiting rescue workers. As Frank was backing out himself, the structure gave way. A concrete slab the size of a car shifted and fell. Frank's crew outside heard the crash and feared the worst. For 10 agonizing minutes, there was silence. Then they heard Frank's voice, muffled and strained. "I'm all right. Just give me a minute." When they finally pulled him out, Frank had a broken collarbone and severe bruising across his back and legs. The falling slab had pinned him, but the hose he'd been dragging had created just enough space to keep him from being crushed. He'd laid there in the dark, in agony, waiting for his crew to dig him out, never making a sound because he didn't want to worry them. Frank Hurd was back on duty 6 weeks later. When asked about that night, he'd only say, "We got the kiddies out. That's what matters." He would never mention his injuries, never talk about the fear, never acknowledge that he had nearly died. That was the way of these men. Quiet heroism was the only kind they knew. But Frank's story was far from unique. Every station, every crew had dozens of stories just like it. Let me tell you about a few more that deserve to be remembered. There was Sub-Officer John Fordham, a 28-year-old former school teacher who had been rejected by the military due to poor eyesight. On November 3rd, John's crew was fighting a fire in a warehouse when they heard banging from inside. Someone was trapped. The building was fully involved, flames shooting from every window, the roof already collapsed in sections. Going inside was suicide. John went inside anyway. He found an elderly night watchman who had been overcome by smoke and couldn't find his way out. The man was too heavy for John to carry and too disoriented to walk, so he stayed with him in that burning building, talking to him, keeping him conscious while his crew outside desperately fought to create a path to them. For 45 minutes, John Fordham and that night watchman sat in a pocket of relatively clear air while hell raged around them. John later said he recited poetry to the man, Wordsworth, Keats, anything he could remember from his teaching days, just to keep both of them focused on something other than the fact that they were probably going to die. When his crew finally reached them, both men were suffering from severe smoke inhalation. The night watchman survived. John Fordham developed chronic respiratory problems that would plague him for the rest of his life. He never taught school again. His lungs couldn't handle it. But he continued fighting fires until the end of the Blitz. "What else would I do?" asked when someone suggested he should retire on medical grounds. "Sit at home while London burns? Not bloody likely." Then there was the case of auxiliary fireman William Sansom, who would later become a famous novelist. But in December 1940, he was just another volunteer trying to keep London from burning. William's station in Chelsea was hit by a high-explosive bomb on December 9th, killing 3 firefighters instantly and burying 4 others in the rubble. William organized the rescue effort while fires raged around them. He set some men to fighting the fires, others to digging out their buried comrades. For 6 hours they worked, under continuous air raid with inadequate equipment and dwindling water supplies. They saved 3 of the 4 buried men. The 4th one, a 19-year-old named Peter Collins, who had joined up 3 months ago, died before they could reach him.
William Sansom would later write haunting stories about his experiences in the fire service. One passage from his memoir captures the psychological toll. You develop a strange relationship with death. You see it so often that it becomes commonplace, yet you never become comfortable with it. Each body you find, each colleague you lose, tears another small piece from your soul. But you can't stop. You can't even slow down. Because the moment you do, the moment you allow yourself to feel the full weight of what you're experiencing, you'll shatter. So you compartmentalize, you joke, you drink, you go back on duty, and you pray that when the war finally ends, you'll be able to put yourself back together again. Not all of them could put themselves back together. The psychological casualties of the Blitz are harder to count than the physical ones, but they were just as real. Men who had been steady and reliable became jumpy and unreliable. Some turned to alcohol. Some simply disappeared one day, unable to face another night of horror. There was no shame in breaking. The real miracle is that so many didn't. Let's talk about the water problem, because this was perhaps the firefighters' greatest challenge. German bombers specifically targeted water infrastructure. They knew that without water, the fires would spread unchecked. By late October 1940, over 400 water mains had been destroyed across London. Firefighters became experts at finding water anywhere they could. They pumped from the Thames, from canals, from ornamental ponds and parks, from swimming pools, even from flooded basements. They created relay systems with one pump feeding another, sometimes stretching for miles to get water to a fire. One legendary operation involved pumping water from the Thames, up the embankment, through 5 relay pumps, across 3/4 of a mile of hose to fight a massive fire in Holborn. The entire system was operated by crews working in the open during an active air raid, maintaining the chain of pumps while bombs fell around them. It took 60 firefighters working in perfect coordination to maintain that water supply for 8 hours. Every single man stayed at his post. When it was over, they'd saved an entire city block. But sometimes there simply wasn't enough water, and firefighters had to make impossible choices. Do you try to save the burning hospital, or do you focus on stopping the fire from spreading to the residential area? Do you waste precious water on a building that's already lost, or do you let it burn and protect the ones that might be saved? These decisions haunted the men who made them. Station Officer Robert Davies once had to order his crew to abandon a burning apartment building to prevent a fire from spreading to a school. 3 people died in that apartment building. Robert knew they were there, knew they were probably still alive when he gave the order to pull back. But if the school had caught fire, hundreds of children would have been trapped the next morning. "I made the only choice I could," he wrote in his report, "but I'll never know if it was the right one." The camaraderie among the firefighters was extraordinary. Professional firefighters and AFS volunteers who had started out viewing each other with suspicion became brothers in arms. They relied on each other absolutely. When a man was injured, his crew would visit him in hospital. When a man was killed, his crew would attend the funeral and support his family. They were a family themselves, bound together by shared trauma and shared purpose. There were lighter moments too, moments of humanity that broke through the darkness. Crews would share their rations with bombed-out families. They'd rescue pets along with people.
One crew became famous for saving a parrot that had learned to mimic the sound of falling bombs, causing panic every time it opened its beak. They'd organize impromptu concerts in the fire stations during lulls in the bombing, singing old music hall songs and trying to remember what normal life felt like. One Christmas Eve, a crew in Poplar was fighting a fire in a toy warehouse when they realized that all the toys would be destroyed. So they formed a chain and salvaged everything they could, working between firefighting efforts. They distributed those toys to bombed-out children in their neighborhood on Christmas morning. The gesture didn't make the papers, didn't earn any medals. It was just firefighters being human, refusing to let the war steal every bit of joy from the world. The equipment they worked with was constantly evolving. American-made fire engines began arriving as part of Lend-Lease, and they were revelations, powerful, reliable, well-designed. British firefighters who had been making do with converted trucks and antiquated equipment suddenly had tools that matched their courage. But even the best equipment couldn't solve every problem. The fundamental challenge remained. There were never enough firefighters, never enough water, never enough hours in the night to fight all the fires that needed fighting. As winter deepened into early 1941, something began to change. The Luftwaffe's bombing campaign was evolving. They were striking different targets, using different tactics. And the firefighters were evolving too. They'd learned hard lessons in blood and smoke, and they'd become incredibly effective. Response times had improved, tactics had been refined, the cooperation between different fire brigades had become seamless. But the worst was yet to come. In April and May 1941, the Luftwaffe would launch their final, most devastating raids on London. These would be the nights that would test everything the firefighters had learned, that would push them to, and sometimes beyond, their breaking point. We're going to explore those final raids in Part 3, and I promise you what's coming will leave you speechless. But before we get there, please like this video and leave a comment telling me which of these stories affected you most. The firefighters of the London Blitz weren't superhuman. They were ordinary people who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances and refused to yield. They were scared, they were exhausted, they doubted themselves. But they showed up night after night, and they did the impossible. In Part 3, we'll witness the culmination of their struggle, the nights that nearly broke them, and the ultimate triumph of the human spirit over mechanized terror. The story isn't over yet. In fact, the most incredible part is still to come. Stay tuned for the final chapter of The Night London Burned.
May 10th, 1941. If you remember only one date from the London Blitz, remember this one. This was the night that nearly broke London. This was the night that tested every lesson the firefighters had learned, pushed them beyond human endurance, and forced them to confront the very real possibility that they might lose. But this was also the night that proved, once and for all, that the spirit of London could not be extinguished. The evening started quietly, deceptively so. Firefighters across London were at their stations, some playing cards, some writing letters home, some simply trying to catch a few hours of sleep before the sirens wailed again. They'd been through this routine hundreds of times now. They were veterans, hardened by 8 months of continuous bombing. But tonight would be different. Tonight, the Luftwaffe would throw everything they had at London in one final apocalyptic assault. At 11:00 p.m., the sirens began. Nothing unusual there. But within minutes, the reports started flooding in. Multiple fires in Westminster, fires in the city, fires in the East End, fires everywhere. This wasn't a normal raid. This was something else entirely. Over 500 German bombers filled the skies over London that night, more than had ever attacked the city in a single raid. They carried a deadly mix of high-explosive bombs and incendiaries, tens of thousands of incendiaries. The plan was simple and devastating. Start so many fires that the firefighters couldn't possibly fight them all, then destroy the city in the resulting inferno. And for a while, it looked like the plan might work. Station Officer James Murray, now a veteran of countless raids, later described the scene. The whole city seemed to be burning. Everywhere you looked, there were flames. The smoke was so thick you couldn't see 10 feet in front of you. The heat was indescribable, like standing in front of a blast furnace. And the noise? God, the noise. Bombs falling, buildings collapsing, fires roaring, people screaming. It was the end of the world. If you've been with us through parts 1 and 2, you know what these firefighters are capable of. But tonight, they would be pushed further than ever before. Stay with me. This is where legends are truly made. By midnight, over 2,000 fires were burning across London. Let me put that in perspective. A major fire, one that requires multiple engines and crews, was classified as a 30-pump fire if it needed 30 pumps to fight it. On May 10th, there were 9 fires burning simultaneously that were classified as 100-pump fires or larger. One fire in the Surrey docks was a 300-pump fire, meaning it required 300 pumping units, over 2,000 firefighters, just to contain it. But here's the nightmare. London only had about 2,000 pumps total. Every single fire engine in the city was committed. There were no reserves, no backup. If a new fire started, there was nothing to send to it. And new fires were starting constantly. Every few minutes, another building would be hit by incendiaries. Every few minutes, another desperate call would come in. Fire at such and such address, spreading rapidly. We need engines now. And the dispatchers had to make impossible decisions. Which fires do we fight? And which fires do we let burn? Sub-Officer Patrick O'Brien, a 35-year-old former dock worker, was commanding a crew in Bermondsey when the night began. By 1 a.m., they had fought 6 separate fires. They were exhausted, their water supplies were running low, and they just received word that there were no reserve engines available if they needed help. Then came the call that would define Patrick's war. Westminster Abbey was burning. Westminster Abbey, where kings and queens had been crowned for nearly 1,000 years, where England's greatest poets and heroes lay buried, where the nation's history lived in stone and glass. If the Abbey fell, it would be a wound in the British soul that might never heal. Patrick's crew was the closest available unit. They raced through streets choked with debris and flames, dodging bomb craters and collapsed buildings. When they arrived at the Abbey, they found the roof already ablaze. Incendiaries had penetrated the ancient timbers, and the fire was spreading rapidly through the roof space. But here's where 8 months of experience made the difference. Patrick didn't waste time trying to save the roof. It was already lost. Instead, he focused on preventing the fire from spreading down into the main structure of the Abbey. He positioned his men at critical points, creating a water curtain between the burning roof and the irreplaceable treasures below. For 4 hours, Patrick's crew held that line. The roof collapsed around them, sending showers of burning debris into the Abbey. Stone gargoyles, heated to breaking point, exploded and fell. Medieval timbers turned to charcoal, crashed down, but Patrick and his men never wavered. They adjusted their positions as needed, maintained their water supply through 3 different relay systems, and refused to give an inch. When dawn finally came and the all-clear sounded, Westminster Abbey still stood. The roof was gone, but the structure was intact. The coronation chair untouched. The Poet's Corner saved, the tomb of the unknown warrior protected. Patrick O'Brien and his crew had preserved a piece of England's soul. He downplayed it later. We just did our job. The Abbey needed saving, so we saved it. That's what we're here for. He would receive the George Medal for his actions that night, though he tried to refuse it, saying his entire crew deserved recognition equally. But while Patrick was saving Westminster Abbey, other crews were fighting their own desperate battles across London. At the Houses of Parliament, firefighters saved the medieval Westminster Hall, though the House of Commons chamber was destroyed. At the British Museum, crews protected irreplaceable manuscripts and artifacts, though parts of the building burned. At St. James's Palace, at the Tower of London, at historic churches and buildings across the capital, firefighters made their stands and refused to let history burn. And in the residential areas, away from the famous landmarks, firefighters were doing the even harder work of saving ordinary people's homes and lives. Because while losing Westminster Abbey would have been a symbolic catastrophe, every burning tenement contained real people, real families, real lives that mattered just as much.
Auxiliary fireman David Chen, a 22-year-old whose parents had immigrated from China to run a restaurant in Limehouse, spent that night rescuing trapped families from a bombed-down apartment block. David made 7 trips into that unstable, burning structure. 7 times he carried people out, an elderly woman, 2 children, a man with a broken leg, a mother with her baby, 2 teenagers, and finally a cat that a little girl refused to leave the shelter without. On his 8th trip in, looking for anyone else might be trapped, the building collapsed. David's body was found 3 days later. He was posthumously awarded the George Cross, Britain's highest civilian decoration for bravery. His parents accepted the medal with quiet dignity, saying that David had always believed that London was his home, and he died protecting it. Stories like David's played out across London that night. Firefighters who had been fighting fires for 8 hours straight, who were running on nothing but adrenaline and determination, who had every reason to say, "I've done enough," kept going back into burning buildings, kept fighting impossible fires, kept saving lives. The water situation became critical. With so many fires burning simultaneously, the water pressure in the mains dropped to almost nothing. Firefighters found themselves with hoses connected to hydrants that produced nothing but a trickle. The relay systems from the Thames became literal lifelines. Chains of pumps stretching for miles, each one struggling to maintain pressure, each one operated by crews working in the open during the raid. One relay system, stretching from the Thames to Holborn, was hit by a bomb that destroyed 2 pumps and killed 4 firefighters. The remaining crews immediately repositioned, filling the gap, maintaining the water supply to fires that couldn't be allowed to spread. They worked around the bodies of their dead comrades, because stopping wasn't an option. By 3 a.m., firefighters were making brutal calculations. With finite water and finite manpower, they were practicing a kind of battlefield triage. Save what could be saved, contain what couldn't be saved but might spread, let burn what was already lost. Every decision meant that something, someone's home, someone's business, someone's history, would be sacrificed. Station Officer Margaret Williams, yes, despite regulations there were women who fought fires that night, faced one of these impossible choices. Margaret was a 38-year-old former nurse who had joined the AFS and somehow ended up commanding a crew in Southwark when all the male officers in her station had been killed or injured. She had to choose between fighting a fire in a residential building where people might still be trapped, or stopping a fire from spreading to a hospital 3 blocks away. She chose the hospital. Her crew fought for 2 hours to create a fire break, and they succeeded. The hospital was saved. But the residential building burned to the ground. Margaret later learned that 2 people had died in that building, an elderly couple who couldn't evacuate. "I made the right tactical decision," she wrote in her report, "but I'll never know if I made the right moral one. I saved perhaps 100 hospital patients, but I couldn't save Mr. and Mrs. Henderson. They died because I chose the many over the few." War forces you to make choices that no human being should have to make. Margaret Williams continued serving until the end of the war, eventually becoming one of the first women officially recognized as a fire officer. But she never forgot the Hendersons, and she visited their grave every year until her own death in 1983. As dawn approached on May 11th, the raid finally began to wind down. The last bombers turned for home around 5:30 a.m., having dropped over 700 tons of high explosive and countless incendiaries. But for the firefighters, the work was far from over. Fires were still burning across the city, buildings were still collapsing, people were still trapped. The crews that had been fighting fires all night kept fighting. There was no changing of the guard, no relief crews to take over. You fought until your fire was out or you physically couldn't continue. Some firefighters worked for 20 hours straight that day. Some collapsed from exhaustion and had to be carried away. Some suffered from smoke inhalation so severe they'd never fully recover. When the final counts were tallied, May 10th to 11th, 1941, was the deadliest night of the London Blitz. Over 1,400 civilians were killed. Thousands more were injured. Nearly 2,000 fires had burned. Entire neighborhoods had been devastated. But London still stood, and the firefighters, those ordinary men and women in their helmets and heavy coats, had saved it. This is where I want you to pause and think about something. These weren't soldiers. They weren't trained warriors. They were shopkeepers and teachers, plumbers and clerks, young and old, men and women. And they had just fought the greatest firefighting battle in human history. And they had won. May 10th turned out to be the last major raid of the London Blitz. Oh, there would be more bombing later in the war, the V-1 and V-2 rockets, the baby Blitz of early 1944, but the sustained campaign that had defined 8 months of British life was over. Hitler was turning his attention east towards the Soviet Union. London had survived.
In the months that followed, the fire services underwent a major reorganization. The professional London Fire Brigade and the Auxiliary Fire Service were merged into a single national fire service. The lessons learned during the Blitz were codified into training manuals and procedures that would influence firefighting worldwide. Many of the AFS volunteers returned to their civilian lives, though some stayed on to become professional firefighters. They carried the scars, physical and psychological, of what they'd experienced. Some thrived in peacetime, grateful to have survived and determined to build a better world. Others struggled, haunted by memories of the things they'd seen and done, and failed to do. But all of them had this in common. They had looked into hell itself and had not turned away. They had stood between their city and oblivion, armed with nothing but water and courage. And they had won. The statistics tell part of the story. During the Blitz, London's firefighters responded to over 1 million fires. They rescued over 17,000 people from burning buildings. They saved countless homes, businesses, hospitals, schools, and historic treasures. And they did it while under constant bombardment, with inadequate equipment, often with no guarantee they'd survive the night. But statistics can't capture the human dimension of what they achieved. The mother who got to hold her rescued children again. The patient whose hospital was saved. The family whose home was preserved. The nation whose monuments still stood. The spirit that refused to be broken. Before we end this story, I want to ask you something. Hit that subscribe button. These stories matter. These heroes deserve to be remembered, and there are so many more stories to tell. Today, if you visit London, you can see the results of the firefighters' courage everywhere you look. Westminster Abbey still stands, hosting royal weddings and coronations. St. Paul's Cathedral still dominates the skyline. The Tower of London still guards the Thames. These places exist because ordinary people did extraordinary things. There are memorials scattered across London to the firefighters who died during the Blitz. Simple plaques, modest monuments, easily overlooked in the modern rush of the city. But they're there, quietly remembering the price that was paid. And somewhere in London today, there's probably a very elderly person who remembers being a child during the Blitz, who remembers being carried out of a burning building by a firefighter whose name they never knew. That child is alive today because someone, some firefighter, some volunteer, some ordinary person who became a hero, decided that saving lives was worth risking their own. The London Blitz was won by the Royal Air Force in the skies above. The pilots who flew the Spitfires and Hurricanes were the few who saved Britain, and their courage will forever be honored. But the Blitz was also won by another group who are too often forgotten, the firefighters who fought on the ground, who saved the city one building at a time, one life at a time, one night at a time. They were called the Auxiliary Fire Service, but they were so much more than auxiliaries. They were the shield that protected London. They were the line that couldn't be crossed. They were ordinary people who proved that courage isn't about being fearless, it's about being terrified and doing what needs to be done anyway. This was the story of the night London burned, and the people who wouldn't let it fall. This was the story of heroes who wore helmets instead of capes, who fought with water instead of weapons, and who proved that the greatest battles aren't always won by soldiers. The Nazis thought they could bomb Britain into submission. They were wrong.
Because they hadn't counted on people like Frank Hurd and John Fordham, Patrick O'Brien and David Chen, Margaret Williams and thousands like them. Ordinary people, extraordinary courage. London burned, but London survived. And it survived because someone decided to fight the fires. Someone decided that their city was worth saving. Someone decided that surrender wasn't an option. If this story moved you, please leave a comment, hit that like button, and subscribe to this channel, because next week we're diving into another incredible untold story from World War II, one that will challenge everything you think you know about courage under fire. The firefighters of the London Blitz didn't ask for glory. Most of them never spoke about what they'd done. They just went back to their lives, carried their memories quietly, and got on with living. But their story deserves to be told. Their courage deserves to be remembered. Their sacrifice deserves to be honored. This has been the night London burned. Thank you for watching, and never forget, the greatest heroes are often the ones we overlook.